So I think now we can start. It's a great pleasure to have you here at the Geneva School for Economics and Management. My name is Professor Dorothée Baumann-Pauly. I'm the new director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, and we will launch on Monday officially. So this is actually the preview event, the very first public event we're having here at the center. I'm really thrilled that this first event is immediately a collaboration with a very established human rights institution here in Geneva, namely the Geneva Academy. And before I continue, I want to hand over to Felix, who will also say a few words of introduction.
Thank you very much, Dorothée. Good evening, everybody, and welcome also from the side of the Geneva Academy. So I'm Felix Kirchmeier, Manager of Policy Studies at the Geneva Academy, which indeed is an established organization on human rights, and which it gives me the pleasure to welcome you as a new organization, which I think is very much not only needed by business, but needed in Geneva, really that the Center on Business and Human Rights. So congratulations, and as you say, it's a sneak preview. It's a it's the first event, first public event before even launching the center, so it's a pleasure to be here. At the Geneva Academy, we also do have a project which is the Geneva Human Rights Platform, which is much more recent, so I feel a little bit how maybe you feel as well in that project, which really tries to link up debates, reaching out from the human rights to other areas, be it to business, be it to political science, also those debates reaching out to practitioners, to UN experts, to students, to academia, NGOs, so that's really also why it's very interesting for us to be here tonight and to co-host that event. I also would like to welcome Justine, Nolan, and it's a pleasure to have this occasion, actually, the presentation of this book on such an important topic tonight as a first possibility of collaboration with the Business and Human Rights Center. For myself, it's also interesting because I like coming back to the business and human rights debates. My very first job here in Geneva in 2006 was organizing the very first consultation for the then new SRSG John Ruggie on business and human rights in Bangkok, and I think I met Auret also from that time. So it's really great to see those debates continuing and to link into that again. And finally also to say, obviously, the topic of the evening, so I'm not an expert, I will not speak on that much, but I think modern slavery is such an important topic, such a topic that we see also is dealt with next week at the Business and Human Rights Forum at the United Nations. We have several events there. And also, as you point out in your book, the many facets that it has, modern slavery, and how it reaches to such different areas. I think if we only think of the digital industry, whether it's a resource extraction for the digital devices, or also what is one of the events at the forum next week, the slave trade by apps and Facebook, Google, Apple, and so on. So I think a lot to discuss. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to co-host that event, and I'm very much looking forward to those discussions. So thank you very much, Dorothée, and back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Felix, for such a warm welcome also here in Geneva. After all, we're the new institution here. And I want to thank all of you for your interest. It shows that business and human rights is an increasingly exciting topic to many, and I think modern slavery has become sort of the catch-all term for a lot of human rights issues that also concern business, and I'm really excited to have 4 really world-renowned experts on modern slavery here tonight, and they come from all over the world. To start with Luiz. He works for the ILO and is originally from Brazil. Justine from Australia, and Cindy and Auret are South African, but Cindy's based in the UK, so that's still in the EU. So we have 4 continents represented here today. I don't want to make you sound old, but all 4 of you have been working on forced labor, modern slavery topics for decades. So I'm really proud to have such fantastic experts here tonight. Justine asked me to do an introduction on modern slavery because not all of us in the room are experts, yet I want to use her voice and actually read from her book, which starts out the following way. It's a global goal to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and eliminate the worst forms of child labor by 2030. This is actually one of the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 8.7, in case you're one of the SDG experts. There are currently an estimated 40.3 million people enslaved around the world. This is a number higher than ever in history. We've never had so many slaves in the world. And this means if you want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal by 2030, we need to eradicate 10,000 people. We need to help them to escape slavery every day to get to no slavery by 2030. So this is a daunting challenge. This is how Justine's book starts. And while modern slavery is an increasingly popular term to describe a wide range of human rights abuses, of course there's no one common definition, but clearly it refers to various exploitative labor practices, including forced labor, bonded labor, indebted labor, human trafficking, child slavery, or deceptive recruitment practices. In all cases, modern slavery is an overarching term to describe the lives and labor of individuals under the oppressive and illegal control of their exploiters without alternatives available to them. And very popular cases that have been in the media, of course, are women tricked into sex work, men coerced to work in construction or agriculture, or children forced to work in mines or sweatshops. These are for sure all cases you've heard or read about. So how we will run this panel is in a conversational style, so I've not asked any one of you to prepare a presentation. I'd rather want to ask you a series of questions, and I'll introduce each one in greater detail as I get to you. So I want to start with Justine, of course, as the co-author of this book, co-authored with Martin Berman, her colleague in Sydney. Justine is a professor of law at the University of New South Wales. She's also a visiting professor at NYU Stern, the Center for Business Human Rights, the place where also Auret and I have affiliations. She's one of the, I think it's fair to say that she's one of the leading scholars in this emerging business human rights field. This was also awarded in 2019. She's the Australian Scholar of the Year. And she has written extensively about corporate human rights issues. She's academically rigorous, yet her writing style is refreshingly accessible. And so I strongly recommend reading this book. But let me get to you, Justine, and ask you, what was the objective of putting together a book on modern slavery?
The idea behind the book that Martin and I both had was to try and make this topic more accessible. So, as you can see, that if we were talking about modern slavery 10 years ago, everybody would have been like, what is that? What are you talking about? And it is now the term that is very much on sort of everybody's lips around human rights. But our interest in writing this book was to get it to people to whom modern slavery is still a new topic, and that is largely people in companies. So we've tried to write it in a style that was more accessible and was shorter, cheaper too, because your average academic book is hundreds of dollars that no one ever reads except students you force to buy them. So our idea was trying to get people in procurement divisions in companies, so people who are actually involved in procuring the products for their company. And to our, great amazement, it is those people who have been reading it, particularly in Australia. And there was a story from someone I met with who works in one company, and she said, I was just met with these 3 other people, and we all had your book. And I was like, yes! Because they're exactly the sort of people we're trying to reach. That modern slavery to them is, how could this possibly happen? It's got of no relevance to our company. Wasn't that something that existed in the transatlantic slave trade? And what we're trying to do with this book is focus on what this means today and how it affects each of us as individuals, but also companies.
Great, but you're a professor of law, so how did sort of new legal requirements around modern slavery, particularly in Australia, drive the interest of companies to engage with this topic?
Well, part of, I think, the real renewed international interest in modern slavery was very much driven by the United Kingdom's Act in 2015. And Australia in 2018 also passed a modern slavery law as well. And so these laws are essentially sort of corporate reporting laws. What they're arguing is that companies need to look into their supply chains and report on the risks of modern slavery. So there's lots of other countries doing different approaches to this. Brazil, for example, has a very different approach with its dirty list that Luiz will know a lot more about. The US has a different approach where they use their Customs and Border Protection Service to basically stop goods that are at risk of modern slavery at the border. But very much the mode of law at the moment is focused on disclosure. So California, Australia, the UK, and then in different ways, France, the Netherlands, other countries are looking at making companies involved in this. And a new law is forcing companies to address it and look at the risks of it.
Would you say that new requirement on greater transparency is also driving different corporate practices?
So that's the big question, of which I'm somewhat sceptical about. What it's driving is awareness. There's a lot more awareness about this topic, and that companies are now starting to understand more how it relates to them. For a long time, human rights and business have been, very much on a parallel path. And what these new laws are doing, at least, is that companies are now welcoming people like us with open arms to talk to them. Whereas, 20 years ago or more, when we were working on this, companies were not the least bit interested in talking to us. So now they're inviting us in to have conversations. What I'm not yet convinced about is how those conversations change their practices.
And most of my work has been on global supply chains, and I'm wondering how laws in the UK and in Australia can change corporate practice in a globalized economy.
So these laws, even though they're UK, Australia or California, what they're basically doing is trying to reach beyond borders. So the problem with law trying to address modern slavery is that modern slavery exists transnationally and laws generally operate within borders. So you have this sort of gap, this governance gap, if you like, where a company headquartered in Australia, is operating its supply chain largely these days throughout Asia. So how do we reach out to that through that supply chain? So what these laws are doing, and they're interesting in a way, is sort of trying to tackle that legal assumption that every company, has limited liability and is a separate personality. And that is still very much the law. So even companies within supply chains all exist as legal entities. But it's breaking it down in a little bit of the way, because it's saying, well, if you are that company at the top of the supply chain, we're saying you've got some responsibility for at least understanding your supply chain and reporting on risks in it. So it's different from legal liability within that supply chain, but what it's saying is that you need to look beyond your sort of closed corporate borders and beyond your national borders and say, if the product that we're selling in Australia is emanating from, a factory in Indonesia, then you need to understand where that has come from and the risks along that supply chain along the way. So it's an interesting, very innovative mechanism. I think that is breaking down that separate corporate personality, not in a legal liability way, but perhaps that may happen. But it is innovative in that way. So it's not just a company in Australia or the UK that are affected, because it's wherever aspects of its supply chain. And these days, basically, the supply chains are so global that a company distributing a product in any country, that supply chain could, come from multiple continents. And so it's smaller companies that are going to be affected because they feed into those supply chains.
Well, so having worked with a number of legal scholars, they're all hugely optimistic that the law can solve it all if we just get it right and the law truly has teeth. So I have two questions for you to round up this first section. First, what would you improve in the Australian law to make it even stronger? Second, what else is needed besides the law to make eradication of modern slavery real?
Well, I think that's the first time I've ever thought of lawyers as optimistic bunch, because really? Lawyers tend to be pessimistic most of the time. We tend to be glass half empty type people most of the time. So when you say what could make the Australian law even stronger, well, I don't think it's very strong at all, to be honest, because what the Australian law and the UK law and the California law essentially do is they outsource enforcement to the market. So they say, we want companies to report on this risk, but there's nothing in the law to actually make you do that. there are limited provisions within the UK and California where the Attorney General or the Secretary of State can bring an injunction to force companies to report. But there's no hard, say, fine to report. There's no aspect that directors may be disqualified if they don't report in that way. What it depends on is reputational sanctions. So it's asking the market, so it's investors, it's peers companies, it's NGOs largely, asking them to police and basically say, as a company, you failed to report or you failed to report adequately. So I think what these laws don't do at the moment is have an enforcement component. And so, one way to think about it is if you think about laws around taxation. So if a company failed to report on taxes, would the government be comfortable saying, let's just let the NGOs sort that out, and when they figure out which company hasn't reported, they can name and shame them, and we'll then get those taxes. So I guess my question is, why is it okay to outsource enforcement of human rights to the market, but other aspects we have harder forms of enforcement? So I don't think it's necessarily, it has to be a fine proposal. That's one way of doing it. We should also think about how we incentivise companies to report, so that you may not be able to be involved in government procurement if you don't report. But at the moment, these laws don't include those incentives, and there was a review of the UK Act recently which basically looked at the failure of enforcement and has proposed a number of changes, including perhaps directed disqualification, incentivisation or fines that might work. So I think that the laws as they are, they're a start, but they've got a long way to go with that. And what was your second question was around?
You answered both, actually. And I think we will come back to the enforcement question eventually. So thanks, Justine. Let me continue with Cindy. Cindy Berman is the head of knowledge and learning at the Ethical Trading Initiative. The Ethical Trading Initiative is a tripartite organization that comprises NGOs, trade unions, and companies with a mission to improve working conditions and labor rights in global supply chains. Cindy previously held roles at the UN, at governments, UK, with a focus on Africa and Asia. And I'm keen to know what the ETI is currently doing around modern slavery and why you think the collaborative structure of the ETI is helpful for addressing modern slavery.
Thanks, Dora. And it's lovely to be here. And apologies for being late. Just to follow on a little bit from Justine and talk about a couple of things that the ETI, as this tripartite collaborative organisation, in the first instance pushed really hard for the transparency in supply chains clause of the Modern Slavery Act. The government really at the time thought that this is largely a criminal justice issue, that good companies that belong to our organisation and others would drive a race to the top magically. And so having sent a very clear message from lots of companies that actually they did want a level playing field and having at least some reporting requirement, it has been quite limited in scope, as Justine says. I think the lack of enforcement on the reporting requirement, the fact that at least a third of companies are still not reporting who should be reporting, the fact that there is no clear list of the number of companies that should be reporting or the names of companies. But the more important issue, I think, is the lack of adequate understanding of what you actually do. So once you are aware, and even if you report, and even if you tick the box on the reporting requirement, I think there is not a clear enough understanding of what a company should do and what they should do on their own, and what they cannot do on their own and must do with others. And I think that's where collaboration comes in, because no single company really has the ability to tackle quite endemic systemic issues in many countries, in many sectors. And so if an apparel textile company or or a big retailer in the food industry is sourcing from a factory or a farm, they might be sourcing 2%, 5%, maybe 10% of the supply. And therefore, if they come with their requirements to change the way business is done, it's very difficult to enable change without more leverage from more companies sending a common message. And being clear about the steps that they want their suppliers to take. And also what kind of partnerships they build with local organizations. I think part of the problem of some of this regulation is that it's very top-down, compliance-driven. The compliance is weak, but even if it was strong, I think that without a kind of bottom-up approach that aligns with a top-down compliance approach, it's very difficult to imagine that serious change will happen. And so workers having the right to join a trade union, to have collective representation, local NGOs, local industry bodies, local governments coming on board and having the conversation with a group of companies that are engaging, I think then you start to see the shift is possible. I haven't seen it yet.
I just wanted to ask you about a good example. Yeah.
So there are a number of examples of steps along the way,
Okay.
and but I think in terms of we're seeing glimmers. Mm-hmm. So companies, for example, have taken the issue of recruitment fees as one of their critical factors. It's only one, but many of them are focused on this. And I think you are starting to see a number of companies, whether it's in Mauritius, a large company like ASOS, an online e-tailer, has taken the issue of no fee charging seriously, has engaged with its suppliers, is trying to get the government of Mauritius to ensure that workers are not arriving indebted. There are pockets and glimmers, and a number of other companies are trying to do similar things in other jurisdictions. What we are trying to do as well is bring on board government as a buyer, looking at government's responsibility as a public procurement agent with some leverage, where they're not driven by profit, they're driven, in theory, by services to citizens. And I've been leading a piece of work in Pakistan in the surgical instruments sector, in which we're trying to work with the public buyers at the European level, with their own private sector suppliers in Europe, and all the way down the chain, trying to involve local actors in a small region in Pakistan, in Sialkot, to try and get on board and figure out, well, what's going wrong? Purchasing practices. So governments are driving a race to the bottom and thinking that they're getting, value for money from citizens by keeping costs as low as possible, driving and pushing the responsibility further down the chain. And we've just done a piece of analysis, and so what we found is that through these buying practices of public bodies, the suppliers are getting quite a lot of profit in margin. A number of the big buyers have managed to get some of their tier one suppliers looking more okay. So those export factories are looking all right. They're more or less, but there are only about 5 of them. And the rest is sitting in the sea of governance failures and abuse and exploitation and child labour that's sitting in the informal economy. And for as long as nobody is looking beyond tier one and not taking responsibility for government failures, for industry failures, for buying failures, for all of those drivers, we can't really see change. So I think it's slow, but at least if we're asking the right questions of the right people and starting to identify responsibilities at each step of that chain, I think we're not going to get there.
Thank you, Cindy. You touched upon so many important points, including, I think, most importantly, purchasing practices. After all, we're at a business school here. We want to understand how can businesses drive better practices. Also, you touched upon the role of governments. But you also mentioned a lot of examples in faraway places. So how can people in the UK relate to modern slavery? Don't they always think this is just happening far away? What is your experience with that?
Well, at last count, there are 136,000 people estimated to be in situations of modern slavery in the UK.
In the UK.
And we have an anti-slavery commissioner, and we have steps at the moment to try and strengthen the law. But I think what is important to note is that although some of the big public-facing brands and retailers are probably doing more in this space, the reality is that construction sites, catering, cleaning, security, nail bars, car washes, there's just a sea of exploitation, as well as in the agricultural sector and even in the textile sector, where the just-in-time production is happening just up the road in Leicester, where people are earning £2 often an hour, where the minimum wage is more like £9.50. So you have it really at the front door, and there is more and more awareness, I think, in the media. Last couple of months ago, we had the largest case of 400 victims. A court case found workers from Poland having been deceived, exploited, abused, and the perpetrators were, finally called to account. But I think this is a growing recognition that this really is in our backyard. And there are some institutions that are starting to see the links between, if you've got a really bad immigration policy and you've got a seemingly world-class modern slavery legislation happening in two different universes, and you've got a failure of labour inspection going on, because I think Flex did an analysis that it would take 500 years for every company to be inspected in the UK, given the number of inspectors that exist. So the labour law itself needs to be enforced, let alone the modern slavery law, and then there needs to be a complete divorce from immigration laws and pressures. Because the most vulnerable are obviously migrant workers in most countries. And so I think we're starting to see an awareness. The national referral mechanism is completely swamped now. You're starting to see everybody is referring into the NRM because they want to both alert the authorities that they've at least been aware of some risk. But the reality is that the ability of the NRM mechanism to deal with those issues and the Gangmaster Labour Abuse Authority good as it is very limited in its resource and capacity. So I think we've got some good institutions, we've got some very active citizens and multi-stakeholder organizations, and more people are waking up to this. But I think we've got a very, very long way to go, and trying to get the political masters to focus on anything other than the B word at the moment is impossible.
Also, I just want to ask, what is the impact of Brexit potentially on the interplay between public and private actors on modern slavery? Let's speculate later, maybe. Thank you so much. Let's move on to our next speaker, Auret van Heerden. Auret van Heerden is a lifelong advocate for human rights. He has been working for the ILO starting in the 80s, worked there for several years, and then later became the president and CEO of the Fair Labor Association. I started my career outside of academia working with Auret in the Fair Labor Association, and he has taught me so much about global supply chains and human rights issues in global supply chains and how companies drive the dynamics in global supply chains. And so I'm keen for Auret to speak on those dynamics in those supply chains and how they enforce the risks for forced labor.
Okay, thank you. So Cindy has already painted this perfect storm, described this perfect storm which exists really, of governance failures, enforcement failures, policy failures, enforcement failures, and a global economy that really has outgrown the systems of regulation that we have. So we have global movement of capital, of goods and services, and of people. But if you look at the international institutions meant to regulate those movements, we have the WTO, we have the ILO, but they're all based on member states. They're all based on national jurisdictions. And yet they're trying to regulate transnational flows. So that's clearly a challenge. And on the people's side, the challenge is really complicated by what's been going on in the global economy. And by now we know pretty well how that's playing out, right? We've seen it over the last 30 years. We've seen how the winners and losers in that global economy stack up. And it's supporting a set of global production networks which are more and more fragmented. You just cannot believe the extent to which people are dividing up the tasks that go into making even the most banal products. So the rationale for that is that they're all serving VUCA markets, right? Very volatile markets. To cope with that volatility, you basically need a very high degree of flexibility. If you have a normal workforce on fully loaded contracts in an economy, say like Turkey, it's very hard to achieve any degree of flexibility. It's a very, very rigid system, and it's a very expensive system. The social charges in Turkey and China are 35 or 37%. So it's when you a link in that supply chain, you don't know where your next order is coming from, when it's going to come, how big it's going to be, and when you deliver it, you don't know if you're going to get the next one. If you do get the next order, I can assure you that it will be on a shorter lead time and it will be at a lower price. Some of those orders, if they're replenishment orders, they're placed by the computer, and the computer just arbitrarily cuts the price each time. So the supplier who is now faced with this uncertainty says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the minimum workforce I need to just maintain my facility. And depending on the orders that I get, I'll have to ramp up like crazy, and I don't want to take on all of those charges just for 3 months. So I'll subcontract it. And by subcontracting, they get numerical flexibility and they get margin, because they're normally subbing into a facility which is less equipped, less safe, less secure, and which has probably a lot of unregistered workers. That allows them to then turn around very quickly, produce in a week, in Morocco right now, people are getting orders from Zara on 8-day delivery. And that's from a standing start. You've got to procure the materials, cut and sew them, put them on a truck, and get them back to Zara's distribution center in 8 days. And you don't know if you're going to get the next one. And the next one might be twice the size of the last one. So it's created unbelievable pressures for flexibility in the system and for cost cutting, because all the time those costs are just being squeezed. So you've got to produce faster than ever before for less than ever before. And that's not an easy equation to make work. At the same time, in these countries, a lot of younger workers will not work in factories. In China right now, you cannot get a millennial worker into a factory. I go to garment factories which are 50% full, and they're paying $600 a month, 3 times the minimum wage. People would rather have a crappy job in services than a fully loaded job in manufacturing. And we're seeing this across regions. So despite the labor surplus, they cannot get people into factory work. So what happens? People in neighboring states whose economies are much weaker hear about these jobs, and they seep into those jobs, one way or another. They either go through a broker. If they can, they could go through a registered, recognized recruitment channel. But if they can't, they will find any other way to get there. So, for example, we are finding children trafficked from Vietnam into garment sector jobs in China right now, in Guangdong province. Why? Because they come from a poor part of Vietnam, and Chinese employers can't get workers. So they'll look the other way. They'll accept a 14-year-old kid who's got their older sister's ID card that says she's 16 or 18. So that's a little bit more detail into how that plays out. I just want to come back to your earlier question about purchasing practices. We as consumers love cheap product. We've enjoyed this deflation basically in our apparel purchases in particular, but also in other purchases as well. Chinese apparel exported to the US last year, in real terms, fell below 1990 prices. Prices not seen since 1990. We've all lapped up that deflation. We've combined that with mobile e-commerce to just order huge amounts of stuff all the time, and at prices which are just unbelievable. Amazon, to support that business model, needs an always-on supply chain. Zalando, Alibaba, you name it. They need an always-on supply chain. They can't possibly inventory all that material. So we put this pressure into that system. Goes from Amazon to the brand, from the brand to the supplier, from the supplier to the sub-suppliers, all the way down to raw materials. At every single link in that chain, somebody is cutting the margin to the next player in the chain. Labor has become the adjustment variable. It's become the shock absorber in that chain, because it's the only price you can cut. If you're a supplier or a subcontractor in Turkey, you can't change your material costs, you can't change your utilities costs, can't change your rent in your export processing zone. The only malleable cost you have is labor. So you hire unregistered workers. Maybe 50% of your workforce will be unregistered, to absorb that margin pressure. So this pressure, which we induce for quicker, cheaper, and more plentiful choice, is having these repercussions all the way down the chain. And we end up with very, very insecure jobs. You've seen Guy Standing's work on the precariat and so on. We have these unbelievably insecure jobs, which if they're in a factory nowadays, might well be performed by somebody from outside the country, or at least from outside the city, who has a very strong chance of getting there via some kind of network. Last thing I just want to say about this is, they're not the only people in modern forms of slavery. Because what we're seeing is this trend towards contingent labor extending up the chain as well. So if you look at Alphabet now, over 50% of Alphabet staff are contingent. And in the USA, as you know, if you're non-payroll, half of the Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't apply to you. You're a freelancer. You're an independent contractor. It strips out a whole series of labor protections. And that form of precarious employment, contingent employment, coupled with those constant pressures on costs and margins, are not only happening to the drivers and the cleaners and the security guards on those campuses, they're happening to people who are the core value creators in the business. And when I look at the direction of travel, I'm asking myself, where does this end? You know, when they've shifted 75% of people onto contingent contracts, and they've stripped out more cost. Obviously, they moved then a lot of those jobs back out to Asia, right? But where does this end?
I mean, even at universities, maybe not in Europe, but in the US, there's a large adjunct professor workforce that has contingent contracts that provide the core of what a university does. Lots of teaching, but a lot of insecurity and very low salaries. So it even affects the academic industry. You've given a really impressive account of how supply chain dynamics create systemic risks for what we capture under the term modern slavery. But I don't want this discussion to become too dark, so I'll try again. Is there a way for an individual company in this system to break free and try with different types of purchasing practices to effectively address those systemic risks? Do you have any examples or glimpses, as Cindy referred to, of how to do better?
Absolutely. So, in supply chains, there are a whole lot of set of costs which are difficult to quantify. One of them is time. Another one is being out of stock. Okay, the cost for a fashion brand to be out of the right size and color on the shelf is huge, but it's a difficult cost to quantify. So as some brands are starting to say, we can't run as fast as Amazon. It's just impossible. So what we're going to have to do is get a lot smarter about predicting demand and planning how we satisfy that demand. There's new technology which is making that possible. All the equipment is digital, right? It's much easier to program. It's much easier to reprogram. And it's labor saving in some instances, or it's labor aiding in some instances. So what I'm coming across now is some brands who are saying, we'll use big data to predict this crazy VUCA demand, to pre-prepare pieces, to do small batch production, and even to do direct-to-store delivery, okay? So we can cut out that whole huge distribution center mess in the middle and save days in the process. But to do that, we have to have unbelievably skilled workers, okay? So there's a Hugo Boss factory in Izmir. And for the record, it is the best garment factory on the planet. Okay?
And Auret should know because he visits many.
I work there a lot. And it's a German factory in Izmir. Has 4,000 people making suits, dresses, and dress shirts. Fully digitalized Industry 4.0 factory. They've got a digital twin. They simulate everything in the digital twin before they put it into production. They've got a level of data now where they can go to a worker and say, you're going to make a mistake next Tuesday. And we're going to work with you to prevent that mistake. Okay? Just as they have preventive machine maintenance, they now have preventive people maintenance. This level of efficiency, of skill and efficiency,
could only be German.
To advertise.
Of course it's German.
Right.
Or Swiss.
This allows them to advertise an always in stock, mix and match suit. So you can choose the jacket in one size, the pants in another size, and they guarantee that it's in stock. Is it in stock? Of course not. They don't know what you want yet. But they'll make it for you so fast you won't even notice that it wasn't in stock. Okay? So here's a business model which caters to the dynamics of the modern market with unbelievably high standards, because that's the only way you can be that fast, and it's the only way you can meet those types of qualities. So there is a race to the top underway in even an industry as scrappy as the garment industry. And we need those business cases and those calculations. We need to teach a lot more managers how to calculate the value of time, how to calculate the value of having the right color, the right size, and the right shelf at the right time.
This is a skill that is taught at business schools.
Really
as the Geneva School for Economics and Management and the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights, I hope we can use skills taught here at the business school to become better at predicting and racing to the top, but in a way that allows profits and principles to coexist. Here at the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights, we hope to identify business models that allows for both profitable business, but done in a way respectful for human rights. Let's move on to the next speaker, Luiz Machado. Thank you for joining us. Luiz works for the ILO since 2003 in Brazil with a focus on forced labor. And you very recently moved to Geneva to join here the ILO in Geneva as a technical specialist on forced labor. So you're really focused on forced labor. And I'd love to hear a bit more about the ILO's current efforts to track forced labor. Cindy has been, and also Justine has been referring to data. I wonder, is this data coming from the ILO? And how does the ILO address forced labor through its tripartite structure? In this case, governments are part, and employers, associations, and trade unions. So, please.
Thank you, Dorothée. First, thank you for the invitation, Justine. It's a pleasure to be here with these brilliant colleagues. So, how does the ILO monitor and track data? We have been estimating the number of forced labor in the world for quite some time now, at least 10 years. But we have developed better and better methodologies, statistical methodologies. And our last estimate, which I think is where the 40.3 million comes.
40.3 million, yes.
It wasn't the ILO alone, it was the ILO plus the IOM, International Organization for Migration, and Walk Free Foundation. We together put this estimate put this estimate out there of 40.3 million on modern slavery and 25 million on forced labor. Which, when one sees the previous figures of 21 million in 2012, may immediately say, well, it's increasing. The idea behind it isn't to show an increase exactly. I mean, we have this feeling that it is increasing, but we don't know exactly how many are out there. It's an estimate. But the thing is, this new methodology, because there's a new methodology, we cannot compare it to the previous ones, okay? So what the ILO did recently, just last year, was convey an international conference for labor statisticians, the ICLS. And one of the resolutions of the conference was a new methodology to estimate the number of forced labor, okay? So we're going to use this methodology in probably 2021 to launch a new figure, which will be quite comparable to this last one of 25 million in forced labor and 40.3 in modern slavery, okay? So, I mean, it's not easy, but throughout the years, we've been working a lot with countries, with our members, to develop also and structure their own statistics, working with Statistics Bureau, conducting surveys in countries, and structuring also databases, which then serve as primary sources to then conduct these methodologies. Okay, so throughout the years it's been getting better and better, and I know this estimate will eventually come even closer to the reality. That's what we hope for. So
and you use that data instrumentally to ask governments to do what?
Well, definitely we have, we don't have estimates per country, but we have them per region.
I see.
Then we work at regional level to promote the structuring of policies to fight forced labor. So coming to your second question, that's the focus of our work in a tripartite structure. For those of you who don't know, the ILO is constituted by governments, but also employers and workers organizations. It's the only UN agency that has this tripartite structure. The others, the members are only countries, right, or states. But the ILO has this unique structure, and we work with all three of them. But basically, we put together policies on the 4P principles that you probably heard before, which is prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. Okay, so quickly through these, on prevention, we do a lot of awareness raising. There are campaigns, there are these studies. On protection, we develop mechanisms or tools for protection. We pilot several initiatives in countries on, for example, rehabilitation of victims, providing training, access to services and justice. Also on protection, it was also mentioned here, the importance of labor inspection. So we need a very strong and good legal framework, but if it's not enforced, there's no use to it. So laws are not the solution alone. You need enforcements. And one of the most important figures in enforcement is labor inspection, with their unique mandates to investigate workplaces. No? And there are some interesting settings in countries where they work together with other institutions, like prosecutors and judges, to investigate cases. And then partnerships, we have promoted South-South cooperation, for example, between countries, exchanges, so this all helps. And then specifically for each of our constituents, we developed different tools. So there are, for example, handbooks for employers, help desk, phone applications that you can download to monitor your supply chain. And for workers, you have channels on filing complaints. So there are numerous different examples that we have around the world. And we try to consolidate them into our websites and reports so that they can be adapted and maybe replicated also.
So may I ask, what do you do with governments that are having no strong labor inspectorate? The places where I worked, the labor inspectorate was particularly weak. And often these were, I've done a lot of work in Bangladesh, and this is a sending country, so-called sending country, sending workers, for example, to Gulf states to help in the construction business. And the remittances of those workers to Bangladesh actually are significant for Bangladesh's economy, same for Nepal and others. So what about governments that are actually profiting from a exploitative global labor system that are probably not as cooperative as you wish to build up a strong labor inspectorate and also change policies around recruitment practices for their own citizens to other countries?
Yeah, very good question.
Tough case.
Yes. The ILO has its international labor standards, which are the conventions and protocols and recommendations. Okay, one of the most ratified convention is on forced labor, Convention 29. Almost universally ratified. And one way to monitor the compliance of the convention is through the reports that have to come yearly from member states. But also through our supervisory mechanism, through the filing of complaints. which the constituents of the ILO, and usually these come from the workers, on non-compliance of a complaint or violation of a complaint in a country or in the member states. I can give an example of country that we're recently doing a lot of work with, which is Qatar. And many Bangladeshis, they go to Qatar to work in the construction sector.
And this morning we actually attended the Forum for Sports and Human Rights at the UN, which is currently ongoing, so this topic came up as well.
Sure. So there were a few complaints filed in the ILO through our formal mechanism. And the governing body of the ILO, which is the reunion of the member states, they put pressure on Qatar to take action. So we agreed on a time-bound program there, working on these pillars that I mentioned. And one of the most important impact result that we got was the abolishment of the so-called kafala system, which is the exit visa that workers needed to leave the country, and even the employer's permission to leave the work, their employment and the country. So it was a situation of forced labor. I mean, they needed a visa to come in, but also to go out of the country. So they abolished this. They structured a national referral mechanism, shelter. They're putting together a good system there. So it's one good example that we have. Of course, forced labor is not eradicated yet, but it's a good steps that they put in practice.
Very briefly to finish this up, because you worked so long in Brazil, and I'm always searching for good examples. Would you say Brazil is a country that has made particular efforts to address forced labor?
Yes, particular efforts, yes, but there's still a long way to go.
Okay.
I mean, it's very difficult. Before I talk about Brazil quickly, I had also written here that consumer behavior and responsible consumption is key. And then coming to Brazil, I mean, the government back in 1995 assumed that there was forced labor in the country and began taking action. So it's such a long time, and we still aren't even close to eradicating forced labor. But back in 2003, the government at that specific year took some measures, which was revising legislation, revising the structure of what we call the mobile inspection units, which are these inspection task forces led by Ministry of Labor with the prosecution's office and the police force. So they go all over. Brazil is a huge country, and they go all over. And the result of these inspections is what we call the dirty list on forced labor, which are employers that are caught exploiting forced labor. After a due administrative process in the Ministry of Labor, they're put into this list. There's no penalty linked to the list or the executive order that created the list, but there's transparency. It's naming and shaming, basically. But it's so much more effective than the laws in Brazil, because I think we've had throughout all these years only 1 or 2 cases of imprisonment for forced labor, but in numerous cases of brands that lost a lot of money because they were listed. So there are business reactions to the names in the list, like banks that don't loan money to these companies, or even buyers that stop buying from these companies that are listed.
That's an interesting example.
It is a very interesting example. It's still on the list since 2003, so it's a very interesting instrument, very effective.
But I think it shows that, because a lot of the time in this area of business and human rights, we write off governments a lot of the time, saying they're not doing much. And in this field of modern slavery, we've seen governments and companies work much closer together to be more effective. And one thing I didn't mention earlier with the Australian law, although it's not perfect where we want to go, it does include, it's the first law ever to make the Australian government report. So the Australian government's procurement practices, which are billions of dollars, the Australian government is going to have to report on the risks. And so no other government has done that yet. So it's, governments, we always look at human rights and say governments are not doing anything. And so there are really interesting steps, and they're interesting how they're working much closer with companies in this area.
Cindy referred to that interplay as well. It's supposed to be.
And the UK government is about to produce its first statement in December, if we get it through. But I think it is an important message to be sending. I think when governments start looking at their own supply chain, it can drive change. I think Brazil is really one of the most impressive places on this issue, because you've had really active civil society, you've had Reporter Brazil, you've got Impacto, you've got these forums, you've got a space of zero tolerance to inaction, in a way, which is slightly different from zero tolerance to forced labour.
And just quickly to finish, since Cindy mentioned the role of civil society and NGOs, I mean, they have a very important role to push the governments and push for labor inspection to happen, for example. So they also can make a big difference in a setting like this.
So, this is what happens when you have 4 true experts around you. You ask 1 or 2 questions and they answer many, many, many at the same time. But I also want to give you a final chance to weigh in and raise some questions. I said to hold the thought on purchasing practices, the role of governments, the role of technology, as we heard. What else? The question of who can help with the enforcement, the role of civil society, just to give you some ideas. So please, I'd like to invite you to ask questions. Yes, the mic. Apparently we have it. Ah, perfect. Okay.
My name is Shazia. My name is Shazia, and I'm from Pakistan, and I was very happy to hear about Pakistan and the forced labor, modern slavery in Pakistan, especially in Sialkot. And I would like to ask you that what mechanism do you use when you are negotiating with the government, and what was the outcome? Because there is a lot of modern slavery still in Pakistan, and like making a law in Pakistan is not a big deal. Enforcement is actually in the implementation. So what was the outcome?
Want to take a few questions?
I think that's best. Let's take a couple more, if there are a couple more. I also actually know of some experts in the room. So, sorry, is there? Yes, please.
And Maggie's indicating as well.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I'm a lawyer, and I'm interested in the numbers were very interesting about modern slavery and forced labor. What's the relationship between the two? Can a certain person be subject to both, or how do you distinguish them?
Okay, and then Meg indicated. In the back there. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Meg Rogenstock, and I've worked with the panelists. Thank you, Doro. This is just an amazing panel. My question is really to you, Auret, and it's a little bit provocative. That, I think what the panel has laid out very well is, much improvement on numbers gathering and the integrity of those numbers, and depth Modern Slavery Act approaches that require a level of supply chain transparency and accountability, along with the non-financial reporting directives that are investor-driven, and start to put a price on risk, or at least are aiming in that direction. Tools like the U.S. Tariff Act, which now allows seizure of goods made with child and forced labor. So we've got, none of these tools is perfect. We have a long way to go. But in light of, for example, the revelations about prison labor in Xinjiang province in China, the extensive work you've done there, I'm wondering what it takes to reach a tipping point. This is probably one of the most egregious examples. It's extremely public. A number of the garment factories and the apparel supply chain is implicated here, and yet it's very difficult to rearrange an entire supply chain overnight. And so you've worked in China a very long time and are aware of all the challenges there. I'd just be curious, your reflections, given where we are now, as to, what more distance we have to travel to achieve real change.
Thanks, Mike. Auret, do you want to respond to this question directly, and then we get to data into Pakistan?
Okay. So, you're asking a question about systemic national labor market features, right? And those are very hard to change. Why are they so hard to change? Because supply and demand trumps law every time. You can adopt the minimum wage you like. If there's an oversupply of labor, the market clearing wage will fall, right? So we need to look at places like China, Turkey, countries like that, and see, are these labor market factors supporting the reforms we want to achieve or not? In China, I actually think they are, because of the labor, well, it's a double-edged sword. The labor shortage means that a lot of companies are investing in technology and moving up the value chain. But those who are stuck at the bottom of the value chain are then prone to turn to forced labor or trafficking networks to get people in. And there's some sectors where that's just really widespread, Government is literally saying to them, you know what, you need to go to Bangladesh. You're in a low value added sector where you need low wage labor, and that doesn't exist in China anymore. So if you want to stay at this level of the value chain, you frankly need to go to Vietnam or Bangladesh. Literally, I've seen sectoral associations advising members to do that. So I do believe we are seeing a tipping point in the Chinese labor market, where it's shifting in a direction which supports the reforms and the enforcement that we want to see. But it's going to take some time. I will say that, like Brazil, maybe the Chinese government is attacking these issues very, very vigorously. Some of these labor market features that they don't want to live with anymore. But clearly, in the case of Xinjiang, you've got it's a very particular security situation where all bets are off. But for the rest, like in Guangdong, where I was mentioning those children trafficked from Vietnam to come in and work, that's an issue where you can get government support 100% to address it.
Okay. Do you want to respond to the question specifically on Pakistan? Yes.
So there's no quick answer to that, but I think what we are trying to get the government to recognize is that there's a question of national pride. So the degree to which Pakistan economically, as well as in the perceptions of the international market as just high risk, basket case, means that instruments are being made in Sialkot and stamped made in Germany. And then they...
in Sialkot?
In Sialkot.
Not even waiting to get to Germany.
No, they're not getting... No, they're being stamped made in Germany.
That's the German efficiency at work.
That's the German efficiency. And
I've got nothing against Germans.
And what's fascinating is in Sialkot, you talk about skill shortage. So it's a highly skilled historical family trade. So there's something like 40 to 60 processes before an instrument is ready. And the young people don't want to go into the industry. They are being undercut by other markets. And so going to the Pakistan government saying, you better wake up, because you're not only losing export share, but you are also, we did a value chain analysis and showing that sort of 3% is going to Pakistan in relation to the rest of the value chain, the profit that's being made on a single instrument. And within that 3%, you've got the outsourcing of that supply to the most excluded, the poorest, people who would rather do anything but go into the industry, but actually have no choice. So I think just trying to get the incentive structures right and trying to get to the industry body. So I went to the Sialkot Instruments Manufacturing Association a few years ago, and they said basically, piss off, Whitey, what are you doing here? Child labour is in our country, you don't understand, don't come in on your high horse, talk about human rights. And a few years later, they're starting reluctantly to accept that they are going, it's a survival question for them. If they don't tackle the lack of investment in technology and skills, as well as the social standards, they're going to be out in the cold. And so I think what we're trying to do is slowly, by engaging with the public buyers, engaging with the local actors, engaging everybody along the way, by the way, including, it's fascinating, sorry, I can talk for hours, but I won't. Sialkot has got this historical relationship with a region in Germany called Tuttlingen. And family ties over generations have meant that the instruments often go through Tuttlingen, which is actually very closed, very untransparent. So we've got to crack open that bit as well before we understand what happens to it in the global market. So we aren't there yet, but it's steps, baby steps along the way. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating indeed.
I was just going to say one question before we get to the data question, which we probably should have explained at the start, is that the 40 million is 25 million forced labour and then 15 million is forced marriage with it. But there is no, when we're talking about modern slavery, there is no legal definition of what modern slavery is. It's an umbrella term that accounts for forced labour, debt bondage, sex trafficking. All of these things come within modern slavery, and the ILO then has definitions for each of these components. And Luiz can talk about the data, but it's the 25 million that we're talking about is this notion of forced labour, which is within modern slavery.
That's it.
So I think we should have explained that at the very start, which we failed to.
Yes. But the other part of the question is, yes, one person can be in both. I mean, as Justine mentioned, there isn't an international standard or a treaty or a convention which defines modern slavery. It is in SDG 8 and Target 8.7, it is there. So one of the reasons why we measured it by adding up forced marriage and forced labor situations, But one can be even in forced marriage and forced labor. Not forced marriages, we don't consider as forced labor, but one can be forced to marry for
to then work
labor.
for domestic servitude.
Exactly.
I think the beauty of the modern slavery term is that it's become a very sort of sexy human rights term. I mean, no one can be for modern slavery, right? there's no company that would say, oh, it's not so bad, but we're okay with modern slavery. Everybody's against modern slavery. So it's a term that's sort of brought a lot of people together, coalition.
Like us today, to use that transition. I would, in German efficiency, 7 o'clock, we should wrap up the expert panel. Doesn't mean that we should conclude the conversations. We have a little apéro in front of the door. I would like to invite you all to continue, and the panelists will all be there, and you can continue talking to them. I'd like to thank Justine for writing this book, which brought us together, and Martin Bersma. And the panelists for coming here and contributing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.